They said when she walked, the ground remembered. Her feet sank deeper than any man's, as if the soil itself bowed beneath her weight, not out of respect, but fear. She was called Martha, though few dared say her name out loud. To the masters, she was the giant. To the slaves, she was something older, something sacred, a woman shaped by pain, built from silence. For nearly 30 years, she didn't speak a word, not when the whip cracked, not when her daughters were taken, not even when the wind carried screams through the fields at night. Her silence became legend, a sound heavier than thunder, a grief so deep it swallowed her voice. The plantation lay in Georgia, 1832, miles from any church bell or law. The owner, Samuel Hargrove, prided himself on control of his land, his slaves, and his image of godliness. But behind the manicured fields and painted fences, Hargrove's mansion hid something unholy. The women there didn't smile. The air itself carried the ache of the damned, and among them was Martha, towering, stoic, never breaking. She'd once been sold as a curiosity, an Amazon of the South, her height drawing crowds at auction. But her size only made her a greater trophy, a rarer prize for a man who wanted everything to bend beneath him. When her first daughter was born, the plantation rejoiced. By the 9th, the laughter had stopped. No one spoke of those girls. They lived and worked and disappeared one by one, until only empty cabins and blood-stained quilts remained. Still, Martha said nothing. She cooked. She worked. She watched the seasons change, the masters age, the daughters vanish. Her eyes were deep wells, reflecting nothing. Yet those who looked too long swore they saw shapes moving inside them, like shadows trapped in water. Then came the night of the red lantern. A storm rolled over Georgia, thunder cracking open the sky, rain slamming against the windows like fists. The overseer, drunk and half mad, said he saw her standing in the middle of the field, barefoot in the rain, holding a single red lantern high above her head. Her dress was soaked, her eyes fixed on the main house. They said she didn't move for hours, and when the lantern finally went out, everything changed. By dawn, the fields were silent, the air smelled of iron, and Martha, the woman who had never spoken, was found kneeling in front of the big house, whispering. No one could hear what she said, not clearly, but every man who stood near her claimed their skin turned cold and their hearts stopped for a second. The master, Samuel Hargrove, didn't leave his room again after that night. He screamed for 3 days, babbling about the daughters and the red hands. On the 4th day, they found him dead in his chair, eyes wide, mouth frozen open, as if he'd died mid-confession. The plantation workers refused to bury him in the family plot. They dug his grave far from the fields near the swamps where the soil never dried. The priest wouldn't bless the ground. No one touched Martha. No one dared. She disappeared soon after, vanished like smoke. Some said she walked into the river. Others swore she turned to mist at sunrise. But the fields never forgot her. When the cotton bloomed white again, red stains began appearing among the rows, spreading year after year as if the earth itself was remembering the whisper that freed it. And every so often, when storms gather over that old land, locals claim they can still see her silhouette in the lightning, tall, still, holding a red lantern, waiting for the night to listen again. They called her the Giant of Georgia, though her real name, Martha, was only whispered among the enslaved. To the world beyond the fields, she was a myth, a monstrous woman, too tall to be real, too strong to be broken. But those who had seen her in the gray morning light knew she was neither monster nor myth. She was flesh, scar, and silence, and her silence was more terrifying than any scream. Born sometime around 1803, Martha had been sold 3 times before her 15th birthday. Records from that time don't list her height. They never bothered to measure souls. But stories said she stood nearly 7 feet tall, with hands like shovels and shoulders wide enough to carry 2 bales of cotton at once. Her presence alone made men uneasy. She didn't cower, didn't speak, didn't even blink when others were whipped. The overseers said she looked at them like she was waiting for something older than time. No one remembered hearing her voice. The women in the slave quarters said she had once spoken when she was young before the first sale, before her mother was beaten to death for refusing a white man's touch. But after that, something inside her broke. The world took her voice, and she let it stay gone. When Martha was brought to the Hargrove plantation in rural Georgia, the master, Samuel Hargrove, saw her not as a person, but a marvel, an exhibit of strength he could command. He bragged to his peers that his plantation had the largest woman in the South, and would sometimes make visitors watch her lift wagon wheels or split wood just to show his power. He called her my silent wonder. The name stuck. But for all his cruelty, Martha's silence seemed to unsettle him. Most slaves broke, some quickly, some over time, but not her. The more pain he tried to force upon her, the quieter she became. Even the overseers avoided looking her in the eyes. It was said that when she stared at you, you saw yourself. Not as you wanted to be, but as you truly were. And Samuel Hargrove didn't like what he saw. The slaves whispered stories about her at night. They said she had been blessed by obeah spirits before she came to the plantation, that her silence was a spell, a wall that trapped every pain, every scream, every curse inside her chest, storing it for the right moment. The elders said the ground itself listened when she walked. Her quarters stood at the far edge of the property, near the old oak grove where the dead were buried in unmarked soil. It was a lonely place, but she seemed to prefer it that way. She worked in the fields at sunrise, cooked at dusk, and disappeared at night. Children said they saw lights moving near her cabin after dark. Soft, white lights, like floating candles. The adults told them it was imagination, but even they avoided the grove when the wind was still. Then came her daughters, one after another, 9 in all, each born of the same house but not the same love. No man dared speak whose they were, but everyone knew. Each girl had the same pale gray eyes as Samuel Hargrove, the same cruel line of his mouth. Martha never spoke about them, never wept. She simply raised them, fed them, and watched as one by one they were sent to help in the big house. And one by one, they vanished. The silence of the plantation deepened with every disappearance. Even the birds stopped nesting near the fields. The slaves worked quickly, eyes low, as though the air had turned poisonous. Still, Martha said nothing. Until one winter evening, when the overseer's wife claimed she saw Martha standing in the cemetery, hands pressed into the frozen earth, her head bowed as if listening. The woman swore she heard faint murmurs, not speech but humming, a tune older than any church song. The sound was soft but endless, and it carried across the plantation like a warning. When she told her husband, he struck her for lying. But that night he dreamed of the same hum, louder now, coming from beneath his bed. It was around this time that strange things began happening in the fields. Tools went missing. Livestock were found dead with no wounds. The cotton turned gray in patches like ash had settled on it. And through it all Martha remained silent, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if she was waiting for something to return to her. Perhaps her daughters, perhaps justice. The other slaves began calling her Mother Stone, unmovable, unshakable, the woman who carried the weight of 9 lives and the pain of 100 souls. Children left small offerings at her door, pieces of cloth, old coins, feathers, hoping her silence might protect them too. By then even Samuel Hargrove avoided her. He'd grown older, weaker, but more paranoid. He said he could feel her eyes on him even when she wasn't there. He ordered her to speak, demanded it in front of everyone. But she only looked at him once, and in that single look, he felt something crawl beneath his skin. He dismissed her from the house that day and never summoned her again. And yet, his nightmares began that very night. Servants heard him shouting in his sleep. Names, numbers, and something about the 9th one. By morning, he'd forget everything, or pretended to, but the dreams kept coming. One morning, the slaves found strange symbols carved into the door of Martha's cabin, spirals, triangles, and rows of 9 dots. The overseer ordered them scrubbed away, but by the next sunrise, they were back, darker and deeper. No one dared touch them again. Her silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was full, thick, alive. When she walked by, the wind seemed to stop. The dogs wouldn't bark. The world itself seemed to hold its breath. That's when they started saying it. The story that spread through the fields like fire. Hey brah, the giant silence is not from fear. It's from power, and though no one could prove it, Every man who had raised a hand to her, every overseer who had mocked her, met a quiet, miserable end. One drowned in a well, another hanged himself, a third simply disappeared into the swamp. Through it all, Martha said nothing. She didn't have to, because in that silence the land was already learning her language. No one remembered when the first daughter was born. Some said it was a warm spring morning. Others swore the air smelled like smoke that day. All that mattered was this: the birth of Martha's first child was the beginning of something that would stain the plantation forever. She named her Clara, a name soft enough to be whispered, light enough to carry in silence. For a brief moment, the women in the quarters smiled. A child, even born in chains, was still a spark, proof that life could exist in a place meant for death. But Samuel Hargrove saw Clara differently. He saw her as property, as a continuation of his own power. From that moment, every daughter Martha bore was counted not as blood, but as investment. 9 children in all, born of violation, raised in shadow, and lost one by one. Martha never spoke of their father, but everyone knew. Samuel Hargrove had long seen his slaves as things to be used, and Martha's size and strength made her the greatest insult to his pride. He wanted to prove he owned even the unbreakable. The first child was curiosity, the second, control. By the 9th, it had become ritual, a sick obsession that blurred the line between master and monster. Each girl grew into her mother's height, her quietness, her gray reflective eyes. They didn't cry often, they didn't play much, they moved like ghosts through the quarters, always watching, always aware. The other children feared them a little, not because of who they were, but because of what they carried. Something heavy and unseen, something that made the air colder when they passed. When Clara turned 12, she was taken to the big house to learn service. No one saw her again. The story was the same for the next and the next, taken at 11, at 10, at 9, and never returned. Each disappearance carved another wound into the hearts of the women who lived there. But Martha never screamed. She didn't fight. She simply kept working, her back straight, her face blank, her silence thick as stone. Some said she refused to speak because if she did, her voice would burn the sky. Others said she had struck a deal with something beyond human, that her silence was the price of vengeance that needed time to grow. But on quiet nights, when the wind turned strange and the frogs went still, a few swore they heard something. Not words, humming, a low, steady tune coming from Martha's cabin, almost like a lullaby. They said it was the same tune she had sung to her babies, a song of comfort that had turned into a song of warning. As the years passed, the daughters became legend. The new slaves whispered their names like prayers: Clara, Ruth, Naomi, Esther, Sarah, Eliza, Hope, Leah, and Grace. 9 names, 9 stories, 9 ghosts. Each name was scratched into the wall of Martha's cabin, carved deep into the wood where the master's eyes would never look. One of the field hands, an older man named Isaac, said he once saw Martha at dawn, standing in front of her cabin with her hands raised to the sky, her lips moving silently. Behind her, the sun broke through the fog, and for a second, he swore he saw 9 shadows standing in a line beside her, the daughters she had lost. When he blinked, they were gone. It was around that time the red stains began to appear. At first, small patches of crimson on the cotton, easy to miss. But as the seasons changed, the stains spread, irregular, bleeding through the white like wounds that refused to heal. Workers tried to scrub them clean. Nothing worked. The master blamed the soil, the rain, the slaves, anything but his own sins. Still, Martha said nothing. She worked those same fields day after day, as if waiting for the earth to speak first. The overseer once mocked her, saying she'd run out of children to lose. That night, his horse was found dead, its throat torn open. He left the plantation the next morning and never came back. By the time the 9th daughter disappeared, the plantation had turned quiet in a way that wasn't natural. Even the wind avoided the trees. The dogs refused to enter the field. Samuel Hargrove, however, became more desperate. He demanded more control, more labor, more devotion. But no matter how many orders he gave, nothing grew the way it used to. The cotton wilted faster, the soil turned black, and the river near the property began to smell of metal and decay. The locals started calling it the bleeding ground. Preachers warned travelers to stay away. The Lord's curse rests there, one said. That land remembers what was done upon it. And yet, no matter how cursed it became, Martha remained. Every morning she walked to the field before sunrise, bare feet sinking into the mud. She would stand in the same place, the spot where her first daughter was born, and stare toward the big house until the sun rose behind it. The slaves who worked beside her said she sometimes lifted her hand slightly, as if reaching for something only she could see. They said her eyes looked different in those moments, glowing almost, like light reflecting off deep water. Then one night, during a storm, a servant claimed to see her standing in the rain again, but this time, she wasn't alone. There were 9 figures beside her, faint, moving, as though made of smoke. He ran before he could see more, but the next morning, the field where she had stood was flooded with red water. The master forbade anyone to speak of it, but the story spread. They said the 9 daughters had returned. They said the land had taken back what it was owed. And they said Martha, the giant, had begun to awaken. From then on, no one called her silent anymore. They called her something else, Mother of Chains, the one who bore pain for every woman who couldn't scream, who couldn't fight, who couldn't be free. She didn't need to speak. The land had started whispering for her. The night the lantern burned red, the sky over Georgia split open like a wound. The storm had been brewing for hours, wind crawling through the fields, thunder rolling low and angry as if something deep beneath the soil was trying to rise. The air smelled of rain and rust. In the slave quarters, the candles flickered out one by one, and the old ones whispered that the Lord was walking through the fields counting sins. But it wasn't God who came that night. It was Martha. She hadn't been seen all day. The storm had driven most of the workers to shelter, and even the overseer had locked himself inside, muttering about the unnatural quiet. When darkness fell, a strange red glow began to appear near the edge of the cotton field. Faint at first, then stronger, pulsing like a heartbeat. The slaves pressed their faces to the window slats, whispering. Some thought it was lightning caught in the mist. Others thought the devil himself had come to claim the land. When the glow brightened, they saw her, tall, motionless, standing barefoot in the rain with a single red lantern held high. The light didn't flicker like fire. It burned steady, glowing from within the glass as if the flame itself refused to move. Her dress clung to her, soaked and torn, and her eyes, those pale, gray, bottomless eyes, stared straight at the master's house. The children began to cry. The women pulled them close, telling them to hush. The men just watched, silent, afraid to breathe. No one dared go outside. Not even the overseer, who peered through the window of his cabin and swore later that he saw 9 shadows standing behind her, each smaller than the last, each one holding a faint light of its own. The storm raged harder. Thunder cracked so loud the windows rattled, but still Martha didn't move. She stood there in the downpour, the red glow washing over her face, her feet sinking slowly into the mud as if the ground wanted to claim her. Inside the big house, Samuel Hargrove woke to the smell of smoke. He thought it was the chimney at first, but when he looked out his window, he saw that awful crimson light pulsing across the field. He shouted for his servants, but none came. The dogs were howling in their kennels, pulling at their chains until their throats bled. He stepped out onto the porch and froze. There she was. For 30 years she had obeyed him in silence. For 30 years she had bowed her head and taken every cruelty he offered. But now she looked up at him, rain running down her face like tears, and he felt, for the first time in his life, afraid. He tried to speak, to shout, to order her away, but the words tangled in his throat. His chest tightened. The red light grew brighter, flooding the fields, reflecting in the puddles until the whole plantation seemed to bleed. Then, without warning, the lantern went out. The darkness that followed wasn't natural. It was thick, heavy, like a living thing. The wind stopped, the rain stilled. For one impossible moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. And then the whisper began. No one ever agreed on what it sounded like. Some said it was a prayer, others swore it was a curse. But every soul on that land heard it, low, drawn out, sliding through the walls and into their bones. One word, then another, then 9, each name carried like a bell, the names of her daughters, The sound moved through the field like a tide, shaking the windows, rippling through the soil, echoing down the chimney into the master's house. Samuel Hargrove fell to his knees, clutching his chest. He screamed that he could see them, 9 faces in the dark, staring back at him. By morning, the storm had passed. The lantern was gone, and so was Martha. They found footprints in the mud leading to the cotton rows. 10 sets, each one smaller than the last, all vanishing into the earth halfway across the field. When the sun rose, the light revealed something strange. Every plant that had grown white the day before now bloomed red. The overseer tried to burn the cotton, but the fire wouldn't take. The flames turned black, curling away like they'd been swallowed by shadow. That day became known as the Night of the Red Lantern, the night when the plantation stopped being just land and became something alive, something angry. The slaves refused to work for 3 days. The master locked himself in his study, pacing and muttering. He said he could still see the glow from his window even when the nights were clear. He said her whisper hadn't stopped. And maybe it hadn't, because from then on, anyone who walked the field alone claimed to hear it too. That same whisper, soft and close to the ear, like breath. The names came again and again until even the bravest refused to enter after sunset. Years later, when the plantation was abandoned, travelers who passed through would find strange lights in the distance. A red glow, faint but steady, always hovering near the ground. Those who followed it said it led them in circles back to where they started, as if the field itself was warning them to leave. Some say Martha still stands there on stormy nights, holding her lantern high, waiting for someone to listen. Others believe the lantern was never a lantern at all, that it was her heart, burning one last time before the earth took her in. But everyone agrees on one thing: Eberschrew, that night, the land learned her grief, and it never forgot how to whisper her pain. When dawn broke after the night of the Red Lantern, the plantation did not wake. The fields, once alive with the rhythm of work and the sound of weary bodies moving through cotton, lay still. Not a bird sang, not a leaf stirred. Even the air felt wrong, cold, damp, heavy with something unspoken. By the time the sun climbed above the horizon, the world around the Hargrove plantation looked like it had been drained of color. The sky was pale gray, the soil dark as ash, and the cotton that should have shimmered white in the morning light now looked frozen, each stalk stiff, each flower sealed in place as though time itself had stopped. At first, the overseer thought it was frost, but it was mid-July, hot, thick southern summer. The air should have shimmered with heat, not bitten with cold. When he touched one of the blossoms, the stems snapped like glass, and his fingers came away dusted with something fine and gray, not ice but ash. That was when the whispers began again, low, drawn out, coming from the fields. The men swore it was the wind, but the wind doesn't call names. It doesn't hum old hymns that only the enslaved would know. And it doesn't sound like a woman breathing between each word, as though the earth itself had lungs. They said the sound came from beneath the ground, deep, muffled but constant. The kind of sound that gets under your skin, that makes your heart thump out of rhythm. The slaves refused to go near the fields that morning. They gathered near the cabins, clutching one another, eyes darting to the horizon where the red lantern had burned the night before. Some fell to their knees, praying. Others packed what little they had and started walking, even though there was nowhere safe to go. By noon, the whispers grew louder and colder. Samuel Hargrove came stumbling from his house, his skin pale, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. He shouted orders, told them all to get back to work, to stop the nonsense, to bring axes and cut the frozen rot from the cotton. But when he stepped into the field himself, he froze mid-stride. The earth moved. It wasn't a tremor or quake. It was a pulse, slow, steady, rising from beneath the soil like something breathing. Each beat made the ground tremble just enough to send ripples through the stalks. And each pulse carried a whisper that seemed to grow in rhythm, a chant that crawled into the bones of every living soul who heard it. She remembers, she remembers, she remembers. The men dropped their tools and ran. Only Hargrove stayed, or tried to. His pride kept him standing even when the sound surrounded him, pressing against his ears, seeping into his chest. He swung his cane at the air and screamed for it to stop. But the moment he did, A sudden chill struck him so violently that his breath turned white. Frost bloomed across his boots, then crawled up his legs. He staggered backward, falling into the mud. But the mud was no longer warm. It was freezing. He screamed as it bit into his skin, clinging to him like hands pulling him down. When he finally crawled free, his coat was stiff with ice and his skin blistered blue. That night, the temperature dropped again. The slaves lit fires inside their cabins, but the flames burned weak, barely giving off light. Children shivered beneath blankets made of rough burlap, whispering prayers to keep the cold away. And through the cracks in the wooden walls, they swore they saw shapes. Faint outlines of figures walking through the field, their forms flickering like smoke, each one holding a dim red glow where their hearts should be. When the wind blew through the cracks, it carried a faint sound. A woman's voice singing something old, something broken. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language the children knew. But the melody made them weep. The next morning, the plantation was silent again. The frost was thicker now, a gray film covering everything. When the overseer tried to harness the horses, their bodies trembled violently, and they refused to move. By noon, one of them had frozen where it stood, eyes open, breath trapped in a puff of white. That was when they found the footprints. 10 sets again, just like before. But this time, the prints weren't made in mud. They were pressed into the frost itself, as if the cold had formed around invisible feet. The prints led from the forest edge to the very center of the field, and stopped. At the end of the trail was something burned into the soil, a circle, perfect and black, where nothing grew again. Hargrove ordered the field burned, desperate to end whatever curse had taken hold. But when they lit the fire, the flames turned blue, spreading too fast, too wide, swallowing everything, except the house. The blaze stopped right at the steps of his porch, as if something unseen had drawn a line there. From that day on, every time the wind blew across the property, it carried a faint echo of that whisper, softer now, but still there, just beneath the surface, she remembers. Farmers passing by claimed that no snow ever fell on the Hargrove land again, only frost, even in the middle of summer. Some said the whisper was still there a century later, buried under the soil where the fields once stood. A few brave souls who tried to spend the night on the abandoned land said that if you lie down in the grass and close your eyes, you can feel it breathing. That if you whisper her name, Martha, the ground will whisper it back. And if you listen too long, your breath will begin to freeze too. Because that's the curse she left behind. Not fire, not wrath, but remembrance. A grief so deep it chills the earth that holds it. The whisper wasn't just her voice anymore. It was the land itself, her sorrow woven into every root, every stone, every cold gust of wind that passed over the fields. The plantation no longer belonged to the living. It had become her hymn, eternal, sorrowful, and unending. By the time summer reached its peak, the Hargrove plantation had turned into something unrecognizable. The fields that once swayed with soft white cotton were now twisted with blackened stalks and brittle leaves that cut like glass when touched. The workers refused to go near them. They said the plants whispered at night, soft, rasping sounds like breathing through a cracked mouth. But Samuel Hargrove didn't believe in whispers or curses. He believed in profit. By July's end, he gathered whoever remained, slaves too terrified to flee, and the few white men desperate enough for coin, and ordered the harvest to begin. The overseer warned him that the cotton wasn't right, that it didn't grow natural, that it smelled wrong. Hargrove dismissed him with a glare that could silence thunder. "Cotton's cotton," he spat. "And the Lord provides no matter how it grows." But the Lord had long abandoned that land. When the first stalk was cut, the blade came away red. At first they thought it was rust or sap, but when one of the men wiped it clean, he paled. It was blood, thick, dark, and slow to dry. The field bled. The more they harvested, the more it oozed. Cotton bolls that should have been white came out streaked with crimson, as though the plants themselves had been watered with veins instead of rain. Some swore they saw the faces of women, faint outlines in the cotton's folds, mouths open as if caught in a silent scream. By midday, the air had turned heavy, pressing down on them like a storm that wouldn't break. The sun was burning bright, yet the ground felt cold beneath their feet. Every time a stalk was pulled, a low hum came from the soil, not wind, not animal, something alive, something aware. The slaves dropped their tools and crossed themselves. One woman fell to her knees and began praying aloud, her voice shaking so hard it barely formed words. When Hargrove shouted at her to get up, she looked him dead in the eye and said something no one ever forgot. "Appa-ee! You can pick what grows here, master, but it'll be you that gets harvested." That night, Hargrove had her whipped. She never screamed. She just kept whispering, "The roots run deep." The next morning, she was gone. The chains still hung from the post, slick with frost even in the summer heat. By the third day, the harvesters began to fall sick. Their skin turned pale, their lips cracked and bled. One man's hands blistered with what looked like burns, angry red marks that wept clear fluid whenever he touched the cotton. When he tried to wash them, the water turned pink. He fled that same night, and when they found him 2 days later, his body was curled beneath a tree at the edge of the field, eyes wide open, mouth filled with ash. Still, Hargrove pressed on. He told himself it was coincidence, disease, madness, fear, anything but what it was. He ordered the cotton loaded into wagons for market, but the moment the bales touched sunlight, the fabric began to darken. The white turned gray, then black, then crimson. The buyers refused to touch it. They said it smelled of copper and decay. Word spread through Carolina that the Hargrove cotton was cursed, that it was grown in graves. No mill would take it, no trader would carry it. Even the slaves who hadn't yet fled refused to spin it. It was around that time that the voices came back, louder than before. This time they didn't whisper, they sang. Late at night, when the moon hung heavy and the air grew cold, a melody drifted across the fields, low and slow, like an old plantation hymn, but with words that no one living could understand. Sometimes they swore they saw her standing at the center of the field, the giant woman, Martha, head bowed, her hands raised toward the sky, her shadow stretching longer than any human should cast. The cotton swayed around her even when there was no wind. Hargrove saw her once. He never admitted it out loud, but the servants heard him pacing all night after it happened, muttering to himself, sweating through his clothes even though the air was freezing. When dawn came, he went into town and returned with a preacher and a bottle of holy water. They walked the fields together, reading scripture, sprinkling water, crossing themselves after every passage. The preacher tried to bless the soil, but when he poured the water it hissed like oil on fire. His Bible pages curled and blackened in his hands. He dropped it and ran. Hargrove stayed. He fell to his knees in the center of the field and screamed at the sky, demanding to know what God wanted from him. The wind answered, not with words but with the soft sound of laughter. A woman's laughter. That night the plantation caught fire again. The blaze spread fast, too fast for anyone to escape. The barns, the tools, even the cotton wagons went up in flames, but the strange thing was this: the flames burned red, not orange, and no smoke rose to the sky. By morning the fire had vanished, leaving behind rows of unburned black stalks that swayed in perfect rhythm, though there was no breeze. The soil beneath them steamed, pulsing faintly like something breathing under the earth. Hargrove disappeared soon after. Some said he went mad and wandered into the swamp. Others said he was swallowed by the same field that made him rich. Either way, when the next owner came years later, he found a strange mark carved into the ground near the porch, a circle of black soil with handprints pressed deep into its edge. 10 pairs. They said that when the wind blew, it still carried the scent of burning cotton mixed with blood. They said that every harvest season, red flowers bloomed in the shape of human faces. And they said that sometimes, when the moon hung low and the night turned too still, you could hear a woman humming, soft, mournful, endless, the song of a mother who planted vengeance in the soil and made it grow. The song of Martha, Hebri, the giant who never spoke, Hebrie until the earth itself became her voice. By the fall of 1825, the plantation had fallen into silence. The fields no longer bore cotton, the barns had long since collapsed, and the mansion stood empty. Windows shattered, doors hanging loose, walls blackened from fire. The Hargrove land was cursed, and no one dared cross it after sundown. But one evening, as the air turned thick with autumn fog, something changed. The ground, which had lain still for months, began to stir again. It started with a faint hum, low and rhythmic, rising from beneath the soil like the echo of a buried heartbeat. Then came the smell, a sweet, rotting perfume that filled the air, half like flowers, half like decay. The villagers said they saw lights flicker on the horizon that night, soft, reddish glows floating low across the fields. Others swore they heard singing, not one voice but many, 11, maybe 12, rising together in harmony that was too perfect, too mournful to be human. By dawn, the fog had thickened so heavily that the plantation vanished from sight, but when it lifted, the land looked different. The soil was darker, the weeds stood straighter, and where the cotton fields had once been barren, strange new plants had appeared, tall, thin stalks with blossoms shaped like open palms, each one tinted faintly red, like the stain of old blood. No one wanted to go near them. But one man, an old field hand who had worked under Hargrove since boyhood, returned to the land driven by guilt and memory. His name was Isaiah. He had been there the night the giant woman, Martha, fell silent. He had seen the fields freeze, heard the whispers, and run when the ground began to move. Now he came back with a single purpose: to make peace. He stepped onto the property just as the sun began to set, carrying a lantern and a small cross carved from oak. His boots sank deep into the wet earth, and with each step, the air grew colder. The plants brushed against his legs, their blossoms opening as he passed, as if sensing him. At the heart of the field, where the soil was blackest, he stopped. The ground pulsed softly beneath his feet. He whispered her name. Martha. A wind stopped. The lantern flame flickered once, then went out. And from the stillness, a sound rose. Faint, almost like breathing, then clearer, until he heard it unmistakably, the laughter of children. He turned, and there they were, 9 little girls standing at the edge of the mist. Their dresses were torn, faded white with smudges of red around the hems. Their eyes were pale, glowing faintly, and their faces held no malice, only sorrow. They didn't move closer, they simply stood, hands clasped together, watching him. Isaiah fell to his knees, tears filling his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "We didn't stop him. We should have saved you." The wind stirred then, soft, slow, like a sigh through the trees. The girls tilted their heads in unison, and from behind them the fog shifted. A shadow rose. She was taller than before, towering. Her body shimmered like smoke, her face half hidden by darkness, but her eyes burned bright, not with rage, but with the kind of sorrow that turns to silence. The giant woman stood there, motionless, her massive hands resting at her sides. "Martha," Isaiah breathed. Her voice came not from her mouth, but from the ground itself. It rumbled through the soil, through the air, through his bones. "They came back to me." Ibri, the daughters, stepped forward, one by one, forming a circle around her. The air began to hum again, low and trembling. Isaiah felt it in his chest, the same pulse that had once frozen the fields. The blossoms around him started to close, their red petals curling inward as though bowing. He watched in awe as the daughters reached out, each touching the soil with their small hands. Where they touched, the earth began to glow faintly red. Martha lifted her gaze to the horizon. Her shadow stretched across the entire field. "He planted pain," she said, her voice shaking the trees. "We plant memory." Isaiah realized then what he was witnessing. This wasn't vengeance anymore. This was remembrance. She wasn't haunting the land to destroy it. She was binding it to their story, ensuring no one could ever erase what had been done. The daughters began to hum, their voices rising in that same eerie harmony that the villagers had heard from afar. The melody wound through the air like smoke, soft and endless. The plants responded, their stalks straightened, their blossoms lifted, and the soil began to move. Isaiah looked down and saw hands, ghostly, translucent, pressing against the ground beneath him, as though hundreds of souls were reaching up, not in pain but in release. The daughter's song grew louder. The fog thickened until it swallowed everything. When it cleared, Isaiah was gone. The cross he carried was found days later, buried halfway into the soil at the center of the field. The next morning, when townsfolk finally gathered the courage to visit the plantation, they found something strange. 9 young oak trees standing in a perfect circle, their bark pale as bone. Each tree bore markings like scars shaped like open hands, and at their base the soil shimmered faintly red, though no one could say why. From that day forward, Locals began calling the grove the Daughter's Rest. No birds sang there, no animals entered, and yet the trees never withered. During storms, people said they could hear the faint sound of singing, the same melody Isaiah once heard before he vanished. Generations passed, and the legend spread. Travelers spoke of a woman made of earth and memory who walked through fog and whispered warnings to men who raised their hands against the innocent. Farmers swore that if they took even a single handful of soil from that land, their crops would wither for 7 years. And those who dared to spend the night there, those foolish enough to mock the story, always claimed the same thing in the morning. They saw 9 girls standing in the field watching them, silent, waiting, and if they listened close enough, they could hear a deep, sorrowful whisper drifting through the wind. We remember. The daughters had returned not as victims but as sentinels, guardians of a truth carved into the soil. The Hargrove name was forgotten, but their pain endured, transformed, rooted, eternal. The curse was no longer about death. It had become a song of remembrance that even time dared not silence. By the winter of 1826, the Hargrove mansion was a ruin, its grand white pillars cracked, windows boarded, and walls wrapped in ivy that grew blacker by the season. The few who dared approach it claimed it still breathed. Sometimes, when the fog rolled low, the shutters would creak open by themselves, and faint candlelight would flicker behind the dusty glass. No one lived there anymore, not since the night Samuel Hargrove vanished. But the house had its own memory. Every board, every brick, seemed to hold a piece of what had happened, and something deep inside refused to let it go. It began again on the coldest night of the year. A merchant named Elias Morton, traveling from Charleston, stopped at a nearby inn. Over whiskey and fear, he listened as locals spoke of the ghost fields that glowed red in moonlight and the trees that whispered the names of the dead. Morton, proud and skeptical, laughed at the tales. He was a man of business, not superstition. When someone dared him to spend one night in the Hargrove mansion, he accepted. At dusk, he rode through the frost-covered road and found the house waiting, still, silent, and almost regal in its decay. The front door was swollen from damp, but when he pushed, it opened with a long, low groan like a sigh of exhaustion. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and something metallic, faint but unmistakable: blood. He lit his lantern and entered the main hall. The wallpaper had peeled to reveal the bones of the house, rotting wood and faded plaster, but the portraits still hung in their gilded frames. They lined the staircase and the hall like silent witnesses, faces of men in fine coats, women in pearls, children stiff with pride. But there was one portrait that drew his eyes, the one at the very top of the stairs. It was enormous, easily 6 feet tall, showing Samuel Hargrove himself. The man was painted with the smug arrogance of Southern gentry, his posture straight, his gaze cold, one hand resting on the back of a chair, the other clutching a silver pocket watch. But what unsettled Morton wasn't the painting's size or expression. It was the faint, dark smear that had begun to leak down from one of its corners. He raised his lantern. The smear was wet, thick, red. He touched it before he realized what it was. The liquid was warm. The portraits were bleeding. He stumbled backward, heart pounding. His lantern shook in his hand, throwing wild shadows across the hall. Every frame seemed to shimmer now, as though the faces within were shifting beneath the paint. He could swear he saw eyes blink, lips twitch. A voice echoed faintly from upstairs, a woman's voice, soft, measured, whispering. He froze, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Who's there?" he called out. No answer. Only that voice again, whispering, closer now, sliding through the hall like smoke. He climbed the stairs, one hand gripping the railing, the other holding his lantern tight. The boards creaked beneath him. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself resisted him. When he reached the landing, the whisper stopped. The hallway ahead stretched long and dark, lined with more portraits. But now, every single one of them wept. Thin red lines ran from their eyes, trailing down the frames and dripping onto the floorboards. The smell of iron filled the air. Then the whisper spoke again. "He kept us watching." Ibrahim Morton spun around, the flame of his lantern flickering violently. "Who said that? Fibre!" The whisper deepened. It came not from one place, but from all directions. the walls, the portraits, the floor beneath his boots. He made us see. His pulse thundered. The faces in the portraits were moving now, eyes darting, jaws tightening, every painted mouth curling into something between pain and fury. One woman's face, pale and regal, opened her mouth and let out a sound that was not quite a scream, not quite a sob. Morton dropped the lantern. The flame caught the rug, flaring orange. But instead of burning, the fire froze mid-air, its light turning blue. The walls pulsed faintly as if alive. The bleeding quickened. Streams ran down the frames, pooling at his feet until the wooden floor looked soaked in crimson reflection. Then he saw them, faint figures stepping out from the shadows between the portraits. Children first, then women, then one towering shape behind them all. The giant woman. Her form shimmered like smoke, bending with the air, but her eyes burned like dying stars. The house groaned as if straining beneath her presence. "You came to see," she said. Her voice rattled the glass in the windows. He fell to his knees, unable to breathe. Then see. In an instant, the room around him changed. The walls dissolved into darkness. The air grew thick with heat and the scent of burning cotton. He saw rows of fields stretching under a red sky, bodies bent under the lash, children crying. The earth trembled with each heartbeat. He saw Hargrove, alive again, standing in the field, shouting, laughing, drunk on cruelty, and behind him she stood, the giant woman, silent, watching. Then she turned her gaze to Morton. He felt her stare pierce through him, cutting deep into the part of himself that still believed this was a trick, a dream, a ghost story. And in that moment he realized the truth. This was no haunting. It was history, alive, angry, and remembering. The world snapped back to the house. The air was still. The lantern flame sputtered and died. The portraits no longer bled. The hall was dark. Morton stumbled outside, gasping, tripping over the steps as he ran into the frozen yard. He didn't stop until he reached the road. When he looked back, the house stood quiet, its windows black, its roof glistening faintly with frost. The next morning, travelers found him wandering the road barefoot, shivering, clutching a single torn piece of canvas in his hand, a fragment of the Hargrove portrait. The paint had smeared beyond recognition, except for one part, a woman's eye staring outward, rimmed in red. He never spoke again. Years later, when the mansion finally collapsed under its own weight, workers clearing the remains found something strange beneath the floorboards of the great hall, a layer of red-stained wood, soft as flesh, pulsing faintly even after decades underground. Some say the portraits had been painted using the blood of the enslaved. Others say they simply remembered the truth too well to let go. Either way, the house still stands in whispers, in the cold, in the fog, in the breath of those who dare tell its story. Because memory doesn't fade when painted in blood. It bleeds. The winter of 1827 arrived like an omen, cold, silent, and merciless. The land surrounding the Hargrove plantation seemed to die in unison with the whispers of the people who had once worked it. The fields that once grew cotton now stretched barren under sheets of white frost. Even the crows, creatures that fed on the dead, had flown away. Only one thing remained in that stillness, the curse, lingering like breath over the frozen soil. By that time, the Hargrove estate was a hollow echo of what it once was. The master was gone, buried in an unmarked grave by hands too afraid to utter his name. The daughters who survived were ghosts themselves, thin, hollow-eyed, trapped in a house that seemed to hum with whispers. And in the slave quarters, the silence was heavier than grief. They no longer sang at night. The fires had stopped burning. It was as if the entire plantation had agreed to mourn in silence. No one knew when the first strange sound began. Some said it was the wind crying through the broken windows. Others swore they heard footsteps on the frost. Heavy, dragging, deliberate. The few remaining workers who dared to stay claimed that sometimes in the dead of night a tall woman wandered near the master's field. They said her back was bent, her face covered by a shawl, and her feet left no prints. She never looked up, but if you watched her long enough she would stop and whisper something only the wind could hear. The townspeople began to call her the giant woman's shadow. No one dared to approach. Old men crossed themselves when they heard her name. The church in town refused to ring its bells after sundown. The plantation had become a place of unholy silence, a reminder of what happens when cruelty leaves a stain too deep for God to wash away. Inside the mansion, the youngest Hargrove daughter, Clara, still lived, or rather existed. She had gone blind years before the winter came. She had not spoken since her mother's death. Servants brought her food, which often went untouched. She spent her days in a rocking chair facing the window, her hands tracing invisible shapes on her lap. Some said she could see things others couldn't, shapes moving in the fog, faces that didn't belong to the living. One night, a farmhand named Isaiah claimed to have heard her voice. He was carrying wood past the parlor window when he froze, because through the glass Clara was speaking to someone, but she was alone. "It's almost over," she whispered. "Mama says it ends tonight." Her words floated into the cold, and Isaiah dropped his bundle, running for his life. That night, a storm broke over Carolina. Black skies, no lightning, only endless wind. The old trees bent and screamed. The dogs howled until they choked. The people who still lived near the plantation said they could hear something beneath the wind. A woman's deep, rhythmic humming, the same song that the slaves once sang when they buried their dead. But now, it came from the main house. At dawn, the storm was gone. The house still stood, but its doors hung open. The snow had fallen inside, covering the staircase and the floor. Clara was gone. The rocking chair was still swaying. No footprints led away, only a long, scorched mark that trailed from the parlor to the back fields. Weeks later, a group of men from town went to see for themselves. They followed that mark through the frozen mud until it reached the edge of the family cemetery. There, in the frost, they found something that made them turn back in terror. 11 small graves, each one marked only with a stone, and beside them a 12th. It was larger, newer, and on it was carved just one word, Mother. Hebrew. After that, no one dared step foot on Hargrove soil again. The house stood empty, its windows like eyes that had seen too much. Travelers passing through at night sometimes reported lights flickering in the windows, or the faint shape of a woman, taller than any should be, standing by the graves, her head bowed. Some swore they heard whispers, others saw her hand move as if beckoning. Years later, when the estate was finally purchased by a man from Charleston, he ordered the house torn down. The workers refused to begin until daylight, but even then, when their shovels struck the earth, they found something buried just beneath the frost. Not bones, but chains. Dozens of them, rusted and tangled, knotted around the roots of the trees, each one engraved with a name. By the time they were unearthed, the sky had turned black again, even though it was noon. The air was thick, unmoving. The foreman ordered everyone to leave. He said it felt like the ground was breathing. That night, a fire broke out on the property. No one knew how. It burned for 3 days, though there was little left to burn. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing but ash, snow, and silence. The graves were gone. The chains had melted, and the mark on the earth, the same long, scorched trail, was back, running from the cemetery to where the house had once stood. People in Carolina still whisper about that winter. Some say Clara's voice can be heard when the wind cuts through the pines, whispering prayers for the dead who never found peace. Others believe it wasn't a curse at all, but justice, long delayed, finally claimed. Whatever truth remains is buried with the snow, sealed under centuries of silence. But one thing is certain: the Hargrove name died that winter, and the last sound the land ever heard was not a scream, it was a whisper. Long after the Hargrove plantation burned to the ground, long after the fields turned wild and the road to the estate disappeared beneath weeds and years, the whisper remained. No one could say where it came from. Some claimed it rode on the wind that blew through the Carolina pines, others said it seeped from the soil itself, rising from the graves that no fire could erase. But those who passed too close at night swore they heard it. A voice, low, patient, almost tender, repeating the same words over and over as if calling a name that had been forgotten by everyone else. By the 1850s, the Hargrove land had become a local legend, a place mothers warned their children about, and travelers refused to cross after sunset. The few who tried told stories that made even the bravest men lower their eyes. One merchant from Charleston said he saw a woman standing in the fog, taller than any he'd ever seen. her hands clasped as if in prayer. When he tried to call out, she turned her head slowly, and the air around him froze. He ran, and he never spoke of it again. Years later, during the Civil War, Union soldiers camped near the ruins for a night. They found no house left standing, only the blackened remains of what must have been the main hall and the faint outline of a graveyard half swallowed by time. That night, one soldier went missing. They found his rifle the next morning, still warm. His tracks led to the graves and stopped there. No body, no blood, just the echo of his last words written in his journal, "Is she still here?" E. Brucher. After the war, the land changed hands several times. Every new owner tried to build something new, a barn, a house, even a school once. But the ground rejected all of it. Foundations cracked, walls sank, roofs collapsed for no reason. One preacher claimed it was the Lord punishing those who tried to disturb the dead. Another whispered that the dead themselves were punishing the living. In 1891, a historian named Dr. Emmett Grayson came from Virginia to study what he called the Hargrove phenomenon. He arrived with his notebooks, his assistants, and his certainty that all ghost stories could be explained by reason. For 2 weeks he examined the land, the graves, the surviving records of the Hargrove family, until one night he vanished. His journal was later found beside the old family cemetery. The final page read only, "The whisper isn't from one voice, it's all of them." By the dawn of the new century, the Hargrove land had reclaimed itself. The trees grew thick, the river rerouted, and the path to the plantation was swallowed whole. The curse had no need to show itself anymore. It had already become part of the soil. People said that sometimes, when the wind was just right, you could hear the sound of chains beneath the ground, like roots made of iron shifting underfoot. And still, the whisper never stopped. Some said it grew softer, others said it changed, no longer angry but mournful, as if after all the pain, all the vengeance, the spirit of the giant slave woman was tired. Tired of haunting, tired of remembering, tired of waiting for the world to understand what had happened on that cursed land. In 1912, a group of local boys stumbled across what they thought was an old cellar near the riverbank. Inside were the remnants of wood beams, melted metal, and what appeared to be part of a staircase, the last bones of the Hargrove mansion. They joked about ghosts until one of them, a boy named Samuel, stopped laughing. He said he heard someone whisper his name. Not shout, not moan, but whisper like a mother calling her child to bed. When he turned around, the others were already gone. A week later, Samuel stopped speaking. He told his mother that when he tried to sleep, someone stood by his bed, humming. The song was old, sad, and somehow familiar, though he'd never heard it before. He said the woman never looked at him. She just stood there, tall and quiet, until dawn. By the third night, Samuel's hair had turned white. The story spread, and soon the town sealed off the land for good. They built a small fence around the area, left a single wooden sign that read "Opera Private." No trespassing, and tried to forget. But time bury curses, it only gives them new ways to breathe. By the late 1900s, the story had turned into folklore. Children dared each other to sneak near the old grounds at night. Ghost hunters came with their machines, their cameras, their bravado, only to leave with footage full of static and eyes full of fear. One recording, captured in 1982, allegedly caught the faint sound of a woman whispering, He took their voices. I gave them mine." The tape was later lost, though some say it was destroyed on purpose. And yet, there were still those who came not to hunt, but to listen. A poet, a priest, a few historians, all drawn by that lingering echo of sorrow. One of them, an old writer who visited in 1999, claimed to have felt a presence behind him as he stood by the field where the graves once were. She didn't want to be feared, he wrote. She wanted to be remembered. Hebrew Day, the land is nothing more than a patch of forest on the map. The graves are gone, the chains long rusted away, the mansion reduced to memory. But when the moon is thin and the wind crawls through the trees, locals still say the whisper returns. Not to curse, not to haunt, but to remind. Because in the end, the giant slave woman was not just a ghost of vengeance. She was the voice of every soul who had been silenced and buried without justice. Her whisper carried their pain, their fury, and finally, their peace. And so the whisper never died. It became part of Carolina itself, in the wind that bends the trees, in the rivers that cut through the old fields, and in the hearts of those who still tell her story. For as long as her name is spoken, the silence will never win.